Hi, and welcome back to our third in the series of Tibet climate crisis talks. We are delighted to have Martin Mills with us today, and our environmental campaigner and expert from Tibet Network, Lobsang Yangtso, is going to moderate a discussion with him, and he's going to give a really interesting presentation with some slides. So let's hope that nothing goes wrong, and I'm going to hand over to you, Lobsang.
Thank you, Mandy. Hi, Martin.
Hi. And thank you for inviting me.
Thank you. So this is the third series of Tibet Climate Crisis Talk of the International Tibet Network. And over here, we try to bring together experts, academicians, and environmental activists, policymakers, and frontline communities to discuss Tibet's environmental issues and its global impact, and then possible solutions. So today we are very happy to have Dr. Martin Mills with us. And so he's a senior lecturer in anthropology at the University of Aberdeen, Scotland, and director of the Scottish Centre for Himalayan Research. His principal research focus is the anthropological study of Tibetan communities, in particular its religious and governmental institutions. He's also author of a book, Identity, Ritual, State in Tibetan Buddhism, the Foundations of Authority in Gelugpa Monasticism. And Martin has also carried out lots of field work in Tibet, Ladakh, China, Northern India, and Scotland over the last 30 years. And he's also a fellow of the Royal Anthropological Institute, the member of Association of Social Anthropologists of the UK and Commonwealth, member of International Association of Tibetan Studies and International Association of Ladakh Studies, and he's also a secretary of the cross-party group on Tibet with the Scottish Parliament and chairman of the China Studies group at Aberdeen and academic representative to court in the University of Aberdeen. So today, Martin will speak on the impact of global climate change on Tibet's cryosphere and Asia's water. So here we have two sessions where in the first session, Dr. Martin will do his presentation for about 20 minutes. And then in the second session, we have a Q&A with viewers, and viewers can also ask their questions in the comment box there, and I'll be happy to read out the questions to him. Over to you, Martin.
Okay, that's very kind of you, Lobsang. Mandy, it's lovely to be with you, especially under these difficult circumstances that we find ourselves in. Just a few words in advance. I'm an anthropologist, but as Lobsang mentioned, I also act as secretary of the cross-party group on the Scottish Parliament, the cross-party group for Tibet. Now, the cross-party group has been carrying out some fairly long-term research into the question of climate change, population movements, population resettlements on the Tibetan Plateau, and this has actually led us to run a full-scale kind of climate inquiry onto climate change on the Tibetan Plateau at the Scottish Parliament. We have been interrupted somewhat by coronavirus, as it has interrupted so many of our lives, but we're still kind of carrying out the research over the summer. We're connecting with international research organizations all around the world. So what I thought I'd just do today is give you a basic sense of the problems we're looking into and the issues that surround the Tibetan Plateau and why that's significant. So I thought I'd start at the beginning with some simple ABCs. So Mandy, if you could put up the first slide, we'll have a quick look. Let's go for the first slide, Mandy. Okay, all right, lovely, thank you. All right, what you have in front of you is a satellite photograph of the Tibetan Plateau. It's actually a composite photograph taken from 80 separate satellite photographs, but it'll give you sort of some sense of what the Tibetan Plateau looks like from space. Tibetan Plateau, one of the simple things to get across here is that the Tibetan Plateau is simply vast. A lot of people tend to think that Tibet as being kind of a place sort of somewhere on the edge of things about the size of Moldova. But in truth, the Tibetan Plateau and the surrounding area is 2.5 million square kilometers. Okay, so that is, roughly speaking, the size of Western Europe. Just to give you a sense of it there, if you look at the photograph, you'll see the sort of green line down at the bottom. That is the foothills of the Himalayas, and that leads into the Tibetan Plateau to the north. And then that big yellow patch up on the sort of top right is the Tarim Basin. Okay, now just to give you a sense of the size, from one side of that photograph, just near the mountains, where the mountains curve downwards on the right, you can just see the sort of white patch curving downwards. That's around Islamabad in Pakistan. Okay, that's one side. That's the western side of the Tibetan Plateau. If you go to the other side of the photograph, on the western side, just where the green begins to tinge in on the right-hand side of the photograph, that is Chengdu, all right? And the distance between Islamabad and Chengdu is the same distance as the distance between Galway and Istanbul. So that'll give you some sense of the size of the Tibetan Plateau. Outside the continents themselves, it's one of the largest geological features on the Earth's surface. And at 5 kilometers, an average of 5 kilometers above the sea, above sea level, it has a massive impact, not just on its own climate, but on the climate that surrounds it. That is, the entire Eurasian landmass is affected, the weather on it is affected by the Tibetan Plateau. And we know that effects that occur on the Tibetan Plateau are things that give us things like our heat waves in Europe. And they, effectively speaking, it's one of the major kind of causes of the monsoon in India. So when we talk about climate change on the Tibetan Plateau, we're talking about a central peg in the entire Eurasian landmass's weather. So it's important from that perspective. Okay, so let's just start with a sense of scale there. Okay, can we move on to the next slide? Now, the Tibetan Plateau, and thanks here to Meltdown in Tibet for this excellently clear slide, actually, so I'm borrowing this one. The Tibetan Plateau is often called the third pole. The reason it's called the third pole is that being 5 kilometers up and having temperatures that often go down, as certainly the coldest day I've ever spent on the Tibetan Plateau, it was minus 62 degrees centigrade that night. So it can get pretty cold. And the Tibetan Plateau contains within it a vast bulk of ice. We call this the cryosphere of the Tibetan Plateau. It's comprised of glaciers and snow and sort of ice under the ground, permafrost under the ground. And that accumulation of ice is the largest accumulation of ice outside the poles. That's why we call the Tibetan Plateau the third pole. Now, the temperature of the Tibetan Plateau obviously varies throughout the year, and during the summer months, as the spring turns into summer, much of that ice begins to melt, and that huge weight of melting ice acts as the headland of most of Asia's rivers. Now you can see this in the picture here, for example. It is the headland of the Yellow River, the Yangtze River, the Mekong, the Salween, the Brahmaputra, the Ganges, the Sutlej, the Indus, the Tarim to the north, which isn't on that picture. And in total, the meltwaters from the Tibetan Plateau provide water to 13 surrounding countries. And that within those within the watersheds of those rivers, we have 1.9 billion people. Okay, now I need to be careful here because not all of that water comes from the Tibetan Plateau. Some of it comes from rain, as it does in all rivers. but particularly during the spring and early summer, when much of Asia is quite dry, those rivers depend crucially on the meltwater that comes off the Tibetan Plateau. So the existence of the cryosphere, the existence of that huge weight of ice, is essential to the continuity of those rivers. And the continuity of those rivers feed the human race. It isn't just 1.9 billion people that get their water, their fresh water supplies directly from those rivers. Those watershed areas also produce food that feeds between 3 and 4 billion people. So that's almost half the human race. So when we talk about the continuity and the climate change issues related to the cryosphere of the Tibetan Plateau, we're talking about one of the major mechanisms on the Earth's surface that provides human carrying capacity to the human race. And if it goes wrong, there will be difficulties. There will be very, very substantial difficulties. And Asia will lose a large amount of its human carrying capacity. And that's not just within Tibet on the Tibetan Plateau, but the areas all around it too. But this is why this is important. Okay. Now, one of the factors about it being so high is that the Tibetan Plateau is profoundly affected by global warming. Now, we all know that global warming is occurring. We may argue about why it's occurring, but we all know that it is occurring. One of the things that most people don't know is that global warming is called altitude dependent. Okay? Basically, global warming occurs within the small skin of atmosphere that surrounds our planet, that we live in and that most of our weather occurs in. That's called the troposphere. It's the lowest area of the atmosphere. It's between 10 and 20 kilometers high, depending upon which bit of the planet you're on. Tends to be a little thinner at the poles because things bulge as the Earth spins. But that troposphere is where, effectively speaking, we live, where our weather comes from, and everything on those lines. And within the troposphere, as you go up, global warming becomes more and more pronounced. This means effectively that much of the Tibetan Plateau is warming between 2 and 4 times faster than sea level. Okay, so this means that the warming of the Tibetan Plateau is a little like the canary in the mine as far as the consequences of global warming are concerned. But also, it has that important structural feature. We may not notice global warming in somewhere like the UK very much, but on the Tibetan Plateau, the last 20 years, the effects of global warming and the effects of a general warming trend have been dramatic. Can I grab the next slide, please? Okay, here I'm going to depend slightly on, there's an organization in Kathmandu. It's a research organization called ICIMOD, or the International Center for Integrated Mountain Development. They recently produced an extensive research report on climate change in the Himalayan and Hindu Kush region called the Hindu Kush Himalaya Assessment. You can actually get it on the internet. You can download it for free if you want to. It is about 650 pages long, so I'm just going to pick out some highlights here because they give us a kind of sense of where we're going. Projections for global warming on the Tibetan Plateau are that over the next century in particular, depending upon how much we influence the environment and how much global warming progresses, those projections see much of the Tibetan Plateau moving up between 3 and 5 degrees centigrade. Now, if you look at the map there, you'll see the kind of the sort of map of India with the Hindu Kush Himalaya above it, all the way through to sort of Pakistan on one side and down to Bangladesh on the other. Just to give you a sense of this, the terms you see on the side, on the left-hand side, are RCP 4.5 and RCP 8.5. These are terms you probably, unless you're a climate scientist, won't be familiar with. They are called representative carbon pathways. And effectively speaking, they are how climate scientists in groups like the IPCC and the UN work out the projections for future climate change. Now, an RCP 4.5 is, effectively speaking, how much carbon dioxide we have in the atmosphere and how much that causes a heating of the Earth's surface. 4.5 is equivalent to, effectively speaking, we tried really hard and changed most things in our economy such as to significantly reduce carbon dioxide output. We shifted to new green technologies and everything on those lines. So that top band, 2035 to 2066 winter projections and 2066 to 2095 projections, will give you kind of some sense. And that means what we're really talking about in a situation like that is that the Tibetan Plateau will warm up, roughly speaking, around 3 degrees centigrade. 8.5 is we do nothing about it. We continue growth as usual. We just keep on going the way we're going, and we keep on increasing carbon dioxide production into the atmosphere. Carbon dioxide levels increase, heating increases, and as you can see here, both the Indian continent, this is on the lower slides, on the lower pictures, the Indian continent, the Tibetan Plateau, really increase very significantly. Now, you might sort of sit there and say, well, this is like 3 or 5 degrees centigrade. Can we not handle that? The problem with this is, and we'll come back to this in a second, the problem with this is the biological world does not work in a straight line. It works by thresholds. One of the major thresholds that exists in the world outside us, around us, that affects climate change is the threshold between 0 degrees centigrade and 1 degree centigrade. At 0 degrees centigrade, water turns to ice. At 1 degree centigrade, it doesn't. So 0 degrees centigrade is a major threshold for the entire cryosphere of the Tibetan Plateau. If you shift just 1 degree above it, it will progressively melt. Okay, so when we're talking about these small levels of temperature change, we are at the same time talking about levels of temperature change that are projected to be around that threshold. So that produces obviously significant effects, and significant effects that spread out over the next century. Okay, so the major projections, as we are presently going, even if we make pretty substantial inroads into carbon dioxide production into the atmosphere, we will still see an increase of overall average temperatures on the Tibetan Plateau. If we don't change anything, we will see major increases. Okay. Can I have the next slide, please? At the same time, those warming events will actually make the Tibetan Plateau considerably wetter. So what was previously ice and snow turns to rain. And that rain and precipitation will actually increase in quantity very significantly in some areas. If we, as you can see in the slides above, again, we've got 4.5 on the top 2 slides and 8.5 on the bottom 2 slides. And we see up to and beyond as much as a 20% increase in precipitation. That is rainfall, snow, all of those kinds of things. Generally speaking, it will push towards rain. Just like here in Scotland, we're getting less snow every year and we're getting more rain. Similarly on the Tibetan Plateau, that will mean more rain. That will also include in places like India and Nepal and so forth. But those are the major changes that are generally speaking accepted, that is what will happen on the Tibetan Plateau. Okay, now, what are the effects of that? All right, this is fairly broad stuff, so let's look at the effects in terms of 3 major areas. The major areas here are in terms of glacial melting, permafrost melting underneath the ground, and shifts in the water distribution of the Tibetan Plateau. And that last one is the really kind of vital one, but we'll come back to it because we need to understand the first 2 first. Okay. Let's talk about Glacial Retreat. I know others have spoken about it, and this has been very much kind of, how should we say, the kind of poster child of talking about climate change on the Tibetan Plateau. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it because I know others have spent time on it, but if we could grab the next slide. the glacial deposits on the Tibetan Plateau, on the Himalayas, the surrounding mountains like the Pamirs, the Tian Shan, the Hindu Kush, with the possible exception a little bit of the Hindu Kush. We're not quite certain quite why yet. Most of those glaciers have been declining in overall mass for certainly the last century. There is some evidence that actually the decline of glacial weight on the Tibetan Plateau, in a small way, actually goes back to the very beginnings of the Industrial Revolution. But certainly since 1960, there has been a dramatic increase in the melting of glaciers. Now, glaciers, you need to understand, are dynamic entities. They exist because snow lands on them and precipitation lands on them. It freezes, and at the bottom it melts a bit. And if it melts more than it freezes, your glacier reduces. If it freezes and it snows more than it melts, then your glacier increases. Now, this is the Drung Glacier, for example, in Zanskar. I took this photograph about 5 years ago. The Drung is one of, roughly speaking, 80% of the glaciers on the Tibetan Plateau and the Himalayan region, which are actually reducing in size. Now, this one has actually been reducing in size for a good century or so. It is reducing dramatically, really, over the last 50 years. You can see, actually, on the photograph itself, you can see the line of the glacier itself sort of snaking up through the bottom of the valley. You can also see where the glacier once was, if you look at that line of deposition about halfway up, about a third of the way up the mountain. Okay, so that'll give you some sense of decline. Some glaciers, certainly on the Tibetan Plateau, are disappearing entirely. One of the problems is it's a little like an ice cube. When a glacier melts, in the beginning it melts a little under the same temperature, but by the time it gets smaller and smaller, its surface area increases, so it speeds up in its melting. And this is one of the real dangers at the moment, is that a lot of the speeding isn't really necessarily because the temperature is dramatically increasing in a particular area. We've put the ice cube in the sun. All that is required is time. It's not a question of the temperature getting any higher and those glaciers will disappear. Those glaciers at present rate will disappear at present temperatures. So that's one thing. And, rapidly melting glaciers produce a whole range of problems, which some of your previous speakers have already talked about. Glacial outbreak lakes, flooding downstream, a whole range of issues like that. This causes major problems for communities that are downstream of these glaciers. But at the same time, the Drung Glacier, for example, is the major water source for the Zanskar River, which a whole range of communities depend upon. So, it's a difficult balance. Okay, but in all of these cases, the decline is pretty persistent and more substantial on the Tibetan Plateau and the Himalayan regions than elsewhere. If I could grab the next slide, please. Okay, this is a slide from Isamod's calculations. Depending on where you are in the world, glaciers either increase or decrease in size. The term that is used is mass balance, or cumulative mass balance. That's basically speaking how big the thing is, how fast it's melting, and how fast it's accumulating. So the mass balance is the number in between that tells you how big they are. As you can see from this slide, areas like Scandinavia, for example, their glaciers have actually been increasing. Why? Because the Arctic itself is melting, and that is turning into snow that is landing on Scandinavia, and that is increasing the size of their glaciers. Okay, that is one of the few places where that's actually happening. Elsewhere, we're seeing a general decline. And as you can see from the black line at the bottom and the dotted blue line above it, the black line is the Himalayas, the dotted blue line is the Tian Shan Mountains to the north of the Tibetan Plateau. You're seeing a persistent decline over decades in the cumulative mass balance. Effectively speaking, we're losing glaciers. Now, one of the things that happens when you lose a glacier is that it produces more water, and that, as I said, creates flooding and everything on those lines. One of the theories that, and this comes out of studies from South America, is that, largely from Bolivia, is that at some point there's a kind of peak. There's a peak water in a glacier's melting. As it melts, the water level coming off it reaches a peak, and then it kind of dwindles. And that is, generally speaking, if you ask the UN, that is what they're expecting to happen. One of the things that has emerged from our climate change inquiry is that that does not appear to always be the case on the Tibetan Plateau. We're just going to move on and look at why that might be the case. Okay, so there's our glaciers. Let's move on. The next problem here is the question of permafrost. Permafrost is, can I grab the next slide? Permafrost is often understood to be frozen ground. Anyone that lives in a permafrost area knows that permafrost is more than just frozen ground. This is actually a photograph from Alaska, where they're also suffering from permafrost degradation due to global warming. I'm just showing it because it very clearly shows you the structure of what permafrost looks like. Permafrost, as permafrost is created, it's basically permafrost is permanently frozen ground. But one of the things that happens is, as the ground freezes and thaws over thousands of years, it gradually separates out the components. So Earth gets separated from ice. And what you can see there is the three layers that traditionally exist in most forms of permafrost. You've got an area at the top, that's called the active layer. That is the area of the ground, usually about the first meter to the first 2 meters, which will warm through during the summer months. Okay, so it's not permanently frozen and actually can be quite active. If you live on the Tibetan Plateau, for example, this is an area that if you are very careful, you can farm. You have to be very delicate with it because you haven't got that much of it, but you can farm it. Now, underneath that, you have a block of ice. That is often called the ice wedge. The ice wedge, effectively speaking, is that separated ice area, and it acts in certain kinds of ways. The first is that it acts as a waterproof shield. All right, in case it isn't obvious, ice is waterproof. And that means that any rain that falls onto permafrost under the ground, it will only fall and sort of melt and run off within the active layer. It won't go down through the ice wedge. Now, those ice wedges can be very deep. For example, Siberia, or in Siberia, for example, there are some areas where the permafrost, that ice wedge, is 1.5 kilometers deep. It's basically a huge iceberg under the ground. And what that means is, effectively speaking, that area of ice constitutes a shield for the movement of water. So on the Tibetan Plateau in particular, when water lands on a permafrost area, it slides off through the active layer and goes down into the rivers. Okay? Now that's one of the major dynamics that actually means the cryosphere, as it is, supports those rivers. Those rivers actually exist and flow nicely from the Tibetan Plateau because water is running off the Tibetan Plateau. Now, this is an issue we'll come back to later. Okay, underneath that, by the way, just in case you're wondering, is a thing called the tullik. The tullik is, effectively speaking, an area of earth underneath the ice wedge. It is, for all intents and purposes, dry. It's warmed by subterranean heat, and it is not permafrost. So the permafrost really is that kind of ice wedge in the middle. All right, let's move on to the next slide. Now, just to give you a sense of this, this is a mapping, a modeling of permafrost distribution and temperature across the Tibetan Plateau in the 1960s. I would hasten to add here, and I need to be very careful with this one, it is a modeling. It is based on an understanding of and measuring of a small set of measurements taken largely between the cities of Golmud and Lhasa. Okay, that's where the railway is at present, and that's where the Chinese government are particularly sensitive about the question of permafrost. So they've measured extensively in that area. And what this map is an extrapolation of the distribution of permafrost according to what they already know about the geology of the Tibetan Plateau. all the way across it. Those dark blue areas are where that ice is very cold. It's a long way below 0 degrees centigrade. The areas that are light blue to yellow are the areas where, effectively speaking, it is making the transition from being ice to being water. The areas where it is red is you have substantial thawing occurring, so you have a flow off from that. And actually, as you can see, southern Tibet, in particular around Lhasa and areas on those lines, you really don't get very deep permafrost. And much of it was thawing by the 1960s. By the time, if you head up onto the Changtang Plateau, and much of the area around a lot of the headlands, you have, particularly in eastern Tibet, you have quite a lot of deep permafrost. Okay, now that was the 1960s. If we go on to the next slide, you'll see what it is like, roughly speaking, now. Okay, as you can see, much of the permafrost is projected to have, effectively speaking, dissipated and collapsed at surface level. That ice wedge is thinning out, and that has a variety of different effects, but it's a very, very dramatic change in, effectively speaking, the whole structure of the earth upon which Tibetans live their lives. As that permafrost melts, you may not see it to begin with, but as time goes on, the land underneath you begins to collapse. If we just move to the next slide. Now, some of your colleagues have already spoken about the question of the increase in natural disasters across the Tibetan Plateau. This is actually, generally speaking, a permafrost problem. So I thought I'd bring in a few photographs from elsewhere. When permafrost begins to melt, two things happen. The first is that the land begins to get smaller. Ice is larger than water. When you freeze it, it expands. When you melt it, it contracts. So if you built a road, look at the top left-hand photograph. If you built a road on top of permafrost and it begins to melt, that's what your road is going to look like. Top right-hand photograph, that's what your railways begin to look like. If you built a city like Yakutsk, for example, bottom left-hand photograph, if you built an entire city on permafrost, this is what is going to begin to happen to your city. All right. Whole buildings, as you can see in the bottom left, on the bottom right, whole buildings begin to, effectively speaking, transform as the ground beneath them buckles and heaves. And this happens both on flat areas, as in all of those photographs, but it also occurs on the sides of mountains. The sides of many mountains, cliffs, hill slopes, if they are deeply permafrost, then effectively speaking, they begin to dissipate. And the thing that holds a high-sided valley, a high-sided mountainside together above a town, begins to fall apart because the ice was, effectively speaking, a glue that held that together. So to begin with, you'll begin to lose infrastructure. The second is you are going to get a lot of landslides and increasingly, potentially even earthquakes as a consequence of the redistribution, because all of that permafrost is water that's frozen. And the minute it melts, that water begins to slide sideways. It follows gravity. Okay? And if that occurs across the Tibetan Plateau, quite literally, the landscape itself begins to reshape around you. Now, we've seen this in a whole range of cases. So we see valley-side collapses, we see earthquakes, but in many cases also simple ground liquefaction. So that's one of the major problems that comes with that. If we go to the next slide, one of the areas where we know most about this is actually the railway that was built in 2005 between Beijing and Lhasa. It covers between the major city of Golmud in the north and Lhasa in the south. It covers about 1,500 kilometers of permafrost. It goes over it. And that's it's a huge engineering feat. It cost them 5 billion yuan. And they engaged some of the most advanced transportation technology they could to deal with the permafrost problem. Now, the permafrost problem, when they first did it, was this: a railway attracts heat from the sun, and it will therefore melt the ground immediately underneath it. Now, that was the major engineering problem. They tried building one in the 1950s during the Great Leap Forward, and they failed miserably because the railway simply transfers heat into the ground. The permafrost it melts underneath it, the railway buckles, and your train crashes. Now, in order to deal with this, and if we look at the next slide, in order to deal with this, a whole series of quite high-tech advances were put forward. Those little poles you can see on the left-hand side, for example, those are ammonium heat transfer poles. Effectively speaking, they transfer heat from the ground underneath the railway and dissipate it into the air. If you look at the photograph on the right-hand side, you can see heat shielding from the sun that is designed to ensure that the area underneath the railway remains quite cool. All of that, as far as can be told, was successful, but it did not take into account the overall warming of the atmosphere around Tibet. That effectively speaking, that would cause the very land underneath it to begin to melt. So effectively speaking, one of the things that we're certainly seeing, and there's a considerable amount of scientific work coming out of the Chinese Academy of Sciences that is pointing towards the constant requirement to rebuild this railway. And actually, there's a lot of material coming out of Langzhou, for example, that is really projecting that this railway has about 20 more years of life in it, even if they work really, really hard to support it. Why? Because the permafrost under the ground is progressively collapsing. And this applies to roads, it applies to railways, it applies to cities, it applies across the board. Okay, so that's what permafrost melt does to human infrastructure. We also need to think about what it does for water. Can I have the next slide? The major problem with water is this. The Tibetan cryosphere, and particularly the permafrost under the ground, as I mentioned earlier, it acts as a shield. It's effectively a waterproof shield. And consequently, that does two things. The first is it causes water to slide off within that active layer at the top into nearby rivers. At the same time, it keeps that water close to the surface. Now, one of the major problems, and we do not have enough data on this one, but one of the major problems that seems to be happening is, effectively speaking, as the permafrost breaks up underneath the ground, holes emerge in it, and the water simply drains down those holes. It's very straightforward. You know, there's nothing terribly technical about it. The water drains down those holes, and effectively speaking, water begins to sink across the Tibetan Plateau. It doesn't go away, and it certainly doesn't run off into a river. So this is seen, effectively speaking, across the Tibetan Plateau. We've seen a widening area, particularly in the grasslands in the east, of whole areas simply turning from what it looks like in the photograph above to what it looks like in the photograph below, as the water table simply falls underneath your feet. It simply drops away, and that means the grass can't reach it to get the water, and the grass simply dies. Similarly, at the same time, water that is flowing, even from glaciers that are melting, particularly in permafrost areas, that water actually is simply staying in Tibet. It's not going into those river headlands. And a lot of those river headlands themselves are destabilizing. The most substantial one here is the Yellow River, of course, that feeds northern China. And this was one of the great puzzles for Chinese policymakers about 15 to 20 years ago, was that the model, that peak water model that I told you about earlier, glaciers are melting, we should be getting more water. What they were discovering was the headlands were beginning to desertify. And the desertification is really substantial at this point in time. Over the last 10 years, 300,000 square kilometers of the Tibetan Plateau have effectively desertified. Now, one of the things they thought was this must be, therefore, it can't be because, well, the glaciers are melting. So this must be because of local land use. This led in particular to the Ecological Migration program, which effectively speaking took all of these river headlands and moved all of the local populace, which were largely nomads and local farmers, out of those areas. They emptied an area, effectively speaking, the size of France, so that to reduce land use in those areas. And this caused massive relocation, which is one of the things that alerted our group to it. The problem with it is all the evidence suggests, or strongly suggests, that this is actually a global warming problem, and that to all intents and purposes, the Tibetan Plateau is beginning to soak water up like a sponge at a deep level. Now, we do know there is a lot of evidence that came out recently out of the GRACE satellite program. The GRACE satellite program, if you've never come across it, is a satellite program in which there are 2 satellites that spin around the Earth very, very quickly. And what they do is they look for gravitational shifts that are occurring. And that those gravitational shifts, if they occur very quickly underneath the ground, are largely because water is moving. And one of the things they found is that the inner section of the Tibetan is gaining water mass at between 7 and 9 gigatons per year. So effectively speaking, the Tibetan Plateau is beginning to act like a sponge. Okay, can I move on to the next slide? This produces a variety of impacts. I'm going to have to be quick on this one, just so we can get some questions in. This produces a variety of impacts. The Tibetan Plateau isn't uniform. It's not just one thing that has one single response. If there's permafrost in an area, such as, for example, eastern Tibet and northern Tibet, then the impact on water flow is very different. So if we look at southern Tibet, for example, one of the things we know is that out of southern Tibet and the Himalayas, water from the glaciers is actually doing what we expected it to do, which is peak water flow. We're seeing an increased quantity of water coming off from the glaciers that is flowing down rivers like the Indus. It's flowing into India and Pakistan and Nepal and places like that. And we're seeing a lot of flooding. We're seeing a lot of glacial outburst lakes. We're seeing a lot of things like that. However, in the central Tibet, when I say central Tibet, I mean the Changtang Plateau there in the middle. The water appears to be pooling in the center. Those lakes in particular, they're filling up. And that sponge effect appears to be occurring. In eastern Tibet, which I hasten to add feeds the Yellow River, the Yangtze River, the Mekong River, to a certain extent the Irrawaddy River, the water from the headlands has to go through a large permafrost areas, and we seem to be seeing a decline in water from those areas. Now that is this creates very substantial problems that are slightly different depending upon where you are in Asia. Go to the next slide. So for example, in India, and this is again from Isabod's Hindu-Kush Himalaya report, in India and Nepal, we're seeing a very large number of flash floods, of increased flow of towns being destroyed, things on those lines. So what we're seeing is that peak water effect. By contrast, in China, on the western side, on the eastern side of the Tibetan Plateau, initially we saw flooding, but later the water began to decline. Now that initial flooding does seem to have fitted slightly with the peak water effect, but the decline has been more dramatic. The decline in water flow. Now, this is a huge problem. China has a very substantial established water flow problem. If we can grab the next slide. There we go. China's water availability problems are huge in comparison with most other most other areas, particularly northern China and northeast China in particular. Effectively speaking, the areas fed by the Yellow River in particular, that water flow has gradually declined and destabilized over the last few years. Southern China is the situation is better, as you can see. Those white areas, those are areas oddly enough, despite the fact that many of them are desert areas, they actually have more water, fresh water per person, than much of northeast China. Now, that's largely because they get seasonal rains, and that's okay, but northern China doesn't receive very much in seasonal rains. If you go to the end of the Yellow River, you have Beijing, for example. Now, just to give you a sense of China's water problems, the world average amount of water per person, fresh water this is, by the way, not salt water. Salt water will help you. Fresh water is 7,500 cubic meters per person per year. That is 7,500 tons of water, of fresh water, available to each person, available to the average person around the world. It's quite a lot, but we do use a lot, actually. In Britain, for example, the average person uses between kind of about 3 tons of water a day, if you take into account electricity and you take into account all of those kinds of things. Now, per year. 7,500. The PRC's average is 2,100 cubic meters of fresh water per person per year. Brisbane, it's about 1,000. In Australia, it's about 1,000. The UN's threshold for absolute water scarcity, this is where your population really are in a lot of trouble, is 500 cubic meters of water fresh water per person per year. Last year, Beijing had 119 cubic meters of fresh water per person per year. So, just to finish off, and if we can get rid of those slides. The real problem that surrounds Tibet and the problem of global climate change on the Tibetan Plateau is one that affects the Tibetan Plateau itself. Certainly, one of the things we understand is the present declines of glaciers and everything on those lines and permafrost. The Tibetan Plateau, its landscape will be unrecognizable in 50 years' time. One of the earliest names for the Tibetan Plateau is it's the snowy land. That was one of the earliest names from the sort of 10th century. It won't be anymore. That much is clear. But the real question here is actually what the Tibetan Plateau provides for the surrounding human populace, not only within the Tibetan Plateau itself, but in almost every country around. For the last 5,000 years of human history, the Tibetan Plateau has given everything that was required for human civilization to exist in Asia. That is water. That seems to be changing. And that is a civilization-changing event. And that is my conclusion.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Martin. I mean, it has been a really very insightful and very detailed, and I'm sure our viewers have now a very clear view of what is happening on the Tibetan Plateau. And you have talked a great detail on Tibetan Plateau, third pole, the impact of climate change, the permafrost, and the grassland degradation, and also melting of glaciers. So thank you so much. And
thank you. I went on a little long there.
No. And I have a few questions over here. So you talked about the impact of climate change on the waters and the headwaters, and how it impacts on the headwaters of Tibet's river. And because of that, the melting of the glacier also has a huge impact. But now what China has is they have policies of damming the rivers, and then they have water diversion projects like South-North water diversion projects. So how much of these policies will have an impact on the already, we have the water scarcity or the water, the decrease of water flow on the Tibetan Plateau?
Well, a lot of the damming projects are a combined response to the huge electricity needs that were required by the East Coast factory cities of China. But at the same time, a growing awareness in Beijing and across the Chinese scientific community that water was, and control of water and its distribution was going to be one of the major problems that the Chinese economy would face. And it is. I mean, let's be clear about this. You know, the availability of water is the absolute limit of your population and your economy. At the present moment, 65% of China's agriculture, 65% of China's fresh water. And here we are, by the way, talking about fresh water. Fresh water is non-salty water. Non-salty fresh water constitutes about 2.3% of the world's supply of water. So it is actually a precious, precious resource. Now, 65% of China's fresh water is used largely for agriculture. About 19% is used by the population itself, and the rest is used by industry. We've already seen certainly that China has increasingly shifted away from agricultural self-sufficiency in the last sort of odd 20 years. It really declared an ending of self-sufficiency in 2013. But the damming is clearly designed in some crucial way to maintain that single resource. The problem with it is that a dam is above the ground. And a lot of what is happening here is below the ground. Water distribution, all you're catching is the stuff that is actually moving, on the surface. So one of the degrees to which it actually helps with that problem that's problematic and a little challenging as far as that's concerned. Certainly, secondly, the other problem with it is the sheer number of dams that we're talking about. We're talking about something like 42,000 dams within the last 10 years. And those dams are spread. They're spread all across the Tibetan Plateau. They're spread particularly on that steppe that occurs between the Tibetan Plateau and the Chinese mainland. And where you're dealing with things like that, one is, if all you're keeping is water, you have a problem of a whole range of other things. Let's take, for example, the Mekong River or the Irrawaddy. They don't just provide water for downstream, they also provide silt, and silt is actually fertilizer. So much of Southeast Asia, for example, their supplies of fertilizer, which normally come down with the river, are actually being blocked by the dams. So that's a huge problem, and it also causes the dams themselves to silt up. And as the dams silt up, that creates instabilities of its own. There's a very significant amount of it. There's something called reservoir-induced seismicity, for example, which is basically speaking, if you have a dam of deeper than 100 meters, it will at some point cause an earthquake because of the sheer pressure forces the water down into the ground and into the fault line and lubricates the fault line, and you get an earthquake. There's a lot of evidence, for example, that came out in 2009 that suggested that the Zipungpu Dam, for example, in Sichuan, may have precipitated the Sichuan earthquake. That effectively speaking, its water levels were falling for days beforehand, despite the fact that it was meant to be filling up. And several Chinese scientists who later kind of slightly disappeared off the landscape, pointed this out. And actually, if people are interested, you can find that in the 2009 edition of Nature magazine, which is a major scientific journal. And they pointed that out. That earthquake damaged something like 2,500 surrounding dams. So the whole dam as a solution to this it produces problems all of its own. And this is one of the major shifts. The Chinese would tell you, and I think they're sincere in saying that they are simply shifting to green technologies, that hydropower is a green technology. But the real problem here is the sheer weight of demand and energy that the Chinese economy is taking up. Its sheer need for water, for electricity, for all of these things. And if you have one big problem there and you shift it into another technology, you're going to have another problem in that other technology. So yes, massive damming is being the solution. They are at this point in time pushing the dams higher, closer to the headwaters, in order to deal with this problem. But again, a lot of this problem is underground rather than overground. And a dam is, largely speaking, an overground problem, is an overground solution.
Thank you. Earlier also, we were also discussing about the collaboration of scientific communities and doing a research on the Tibetan Plateau. So I want to I wish to have you to say more on whether there is any international collaboration of scientific research on the environment impact or the climate change impact on the Tibetan Plateau. And then I would also like to have you explain whether there is what is the relation between the research of the scientific communities with the policymakers, and because sometimes we feel that there is a gap, and so we are not very sure whether the policymakers, whether the scientific community, the research has any influence to the policymakers.
Okay. One is, all right, let's start with your first question here is, if you're looking within the People's Republic of China, there is a large umbrella body called the Chinese Academy of Sciences. Okay, the Chinese Academy of Sciences contains within it 120 universities and institutes and everything on those lines. I think that's them. Those feed in directly to Beijing policymaking. And the evidence suggests, from what I've seen, is that Beijing and the Communist Party are strongly influenced by scientific results. The problem with it is that they do tend to go with scientific results that back their existing policies. One of the problems there is, for example, let's take the ecological migration problem. Once you've sat down and said, we think it's the nomads who are causing this problem, and we've created a policy, on the Tibetan Plateau, 2.4 million people have been relocated and resettled over the last 10 years. That is a huge, huge population shift. Now, some of them, they've only moved 500 yards to be closer to a road and to have new kinds of houses with new kinds of CCTV camera. Some of them, however, particularly those in the Three River Headland area, for example, which is a massive nature reserve that was constructed around the three major river headlands that feed into China. There, you're talking about people being moved hundreds of miles far away. They're being separated from their livestock and everything on those lines. Now, if you've committed to something, which particularly in this case received a very considerable quantity of international criticism, if you've committed to that, it's not an easy thing to turn around and say, actually, we were wrong. It was something else. Now, that isn't easy for any government, but I suspect it's particularly harder for the Chinese government, because the Chinese government's broad overall philosophy of, basically speaking, owning all of the sky and all of the earth, and being really, really in charge from a very strong technological perspective and from a scientific perspective, that is obviously going to be a significant difficulty for them. The problem with it is that in the end of the day, you are still talking about the single most vital human resource, which is water. Well, I suppose there's air. But, air and water are really what you require. And if you have a significant water problem, then you are going to have to face up to that at some point. So the evidence suggests that the Chinese scientific community work with policymakers in Beijing pretty closely. The problem with it is fitting that into, effectively speaking, the governmental ideology of the Chinese Communist Party. Now, there is room for flexibility in there, because the Chinese constitutional structure is two-layered. It's a national system and it's a provincial system. And so that allows for some movement within that. I would hasten to add as well, in this regard, while some of the papers that I've read, you can see Chinese scientists speaking to politicians and speaking to party officials in ways that they know will support the party's position. But by contrast, the party also supplies those universities on an international scale with research output, which is by and large generally reliable, because you can't just write a party paper and send it to some American journal like Nature or Geology Newsweek, because they'll look at it and they'll go, well, this doesn't stand up to the science. So there is a tension there. And a lot of Chinese Academy of Sciences papers are good, solid science. And they're good, solid science. And they are saying most of the things that I have just said. You know, I doubt there's a single serious scientist in China that would disagree with most of what I've said now, nor is there a single serious scientist, for example, in America who's doing similar research, or the British Antarctic Survey that also do research in this area, or ISIMOD. There is scientific consensus on this problem. And the Chinese are deeply aware of the problem itself. The question is, we know what coronavirus does. We know the nature of that problem, but everyone's disagreeing on how to solve it. So, your problem is not in the nature of the diagnosis. It is in the nature of the therapy. And that's where the big policy disagreements occur. Scientists can tell them what is happening. You can't tell them what to do about it. And there's the difference. Does that cover all of your points? I can't quite remember what your first ones were.
Yeah, I think, pretty much, yeah. Thank you. And we have a few questions from our Facebook viewers, and okay. I would like to first ask one of our colleagues, Timbala. So he asked us by saying that with the drastic impact of climate change clearly seen in recent years, what should Tibetans in Tibet adapt to the new climatic reality? What should the Tibetans do to adapt with this new climatic reality, climate changes?
Okay. What should Tibetans do? Well, I would certainly say that they might want to think about, if they live in a steep-walled valley, then they will know this already, then they are going to see under these circumstances a substantial increase of life-threatening disaster. That is from flooding, that is from avalanches, that is from landslides. So if you're particularly here on the in Kham and Amdo, those regions constitute significant difficulties. All right. The second is the underground water supplies, so wells and things along those lines, will shift and change. Now, actually, that occurs on the Tibetan Plateau quite a lot because it's a very geologically active area. Where I often work, for example, in the Western Himalaya, you often see places that used to have villages but don't anymore because the water supply, the stream out of the mountain simply dried up. And that's usually because there's a geological shift. Here you've got permafrost shift. The permafrost shift will create more water in some areas and less water in others because it will simply move away. The other questions are about infrastructure. Roads will collapse more often. They will buckle. So you're going to actually have more road accidents. You're also going to have potentially roads that simply are not passable. And those will turn up fairly regularly. So if you were living on the Tibetan Plateau, in the short term, and when I say short term, I mean the next 30 years, you are talking about increased infrastructural chaos. you are talking about increased loss of lives. You are talking about floods and landslides and road collapses and everything on those lines. So I guess if I was going to give very, very simple practical advice, it would be drive carefully and maybe move house if you are in a sharp area. That would be the most simple advice that I would provide. In the long term, we don't know. We need more data. We need more. I mean, let's come back to this question of international collaboration that you spoke about. The Tibetan Plateau is so diverse, and the areas around it are so diverse, and there are so many other countries bordering on the Tibetan Plateau that its sheer size means we need a huge amount more data to come up with real solutions. And I need to hear practical solutions. The Chinese Academy of Sciences do send expeditions onto the Tibetan Plateau. And they have these big expeditions that they send every once in a while. But they can't possibly cover the sheer size of that plateau. And the real problem is with the information that comes out. You know, information about flooding patterns, about glacial outbreak lakes, all of those kinds of things. This is information that should be shared with downstream countries. That would seem to me to be a basic element of global citizenship. You know, if you are expecting and have all the information that says that there is going to be a flood on the Brahmaputra, and you know, and that is going to destroy houses downstream in India or Bangladesh or wherever, basic global citizenship would require that. But also the other thing here is this question of the politics of science. If you have international teams, proper international teams on the Tibetan Plateau, then many of the elements that politically close down knowledge, you know, that, and this occurs, this applies to climate change as much as it does to coronavirus. Those breaks on knowledge get taken off, and also you get different perspectives, and different perspectives are crucial in science. So, you know, really we do need international teams on board.
Okay, so thank you. I have one last question, and okay. That is that. So earlier you were talking about almost like 1.9 billion, you know, the population depending on the water that flows from Tibet. But here, as you talked about, we have seen lots of environment issues, glacial melting, permafrost melting. And so we have almost like more than like 10 countries, you know, they have their rivers originating from Tibet. So, but then, you know, there is no water treaty between these downstream nations with China. So do you see there is a possibility of having China taking the initiative of having a multilateral agreement or water treaty with its downstream nations? So how, where do we do, I mean, do we see any possibility of that kind of solutions?
Well, there have been negotiations about that have gone on for 20 years. And generally, I mean, the problem is a simple one, which is that if you are downstream, you have to put up with whatever happens upstream, and not vice versa. So they're not equal arrangements. You know, if you are in Laos or Myanmar or Bangladesh, you are dependent upon Chinese water policy in Tibet. And that is not a bilateral agreement. It is a unilateral reality created by gravity. Now, generally speaking, I will say I do not know what the present precise situation is regarding those treaty obligations. That is, it's not an area we have looked at precisely in the inquiry. I know that certainly the Chinese view, if you went about 15 years ago, 10 years ago, was that it placed an undue economic burden on China to be responsible for what happens downstream. And they blocked agreements at that point in time. How those are exactly right now, I couldn't tell you. That's not my field of expertise. It's obviously a key area, and it's a key area for to a certain extent for everyone, because in the end of the day, you know, if the water availabilities reduce, then you're talking about mass human migration. You know, you need to be near rivers. Almost all of our cities, with the possible exception of Las Vegas, are built, effectively speaking, on or near rivers or near the sea. If you don't have that water, then populations have to move in their millions, because you will lose whole cities. We've already seen the situation, for example, just this year, of the Indonesian government saying they have to move Jakarta. They have to move a city of 10 million people. Now, under those circumstances, what we're looking at in the case of the Tibetan Plateau is something that does affect nearly everyone. Because effectively speaking, you know, the Chinese mainland, Beijing, is downstream of the Tibetan Plateau. Just as, you know, Laos and Vietnam are downstream of the Tibetan Plateau. I mean, so everyone's in the same boat to a certain extent. You know, we are going to be looking at desertification on a large scale if the present processes continue. And that is actually a problem in which, effectively speaking, Asian governments across the board, including the Chinese government, are going to need to start asking for help. They're not going to want to, obviously. Who does? But in due course, that is going to be the case. So producing cooperation at this point is vital. We're not very good at it, but at the same time, you don't have very much choice.
Thank you so much, Martin. Thank you so much. It has been very insightful and very detailed, and I'm sure our viewers have really helped, and that has been a great a presentation and also a Q&A. And I wish we have more time, but due to timing, I think we have to end over here. Thank you so much, Martin.
Okay. You're very, very welcome. Thank you for inviting me.
Over to you, Mandy.
Thank you, Lobsang. I want to reiterate what Lobsang said, really. Thank you so much, Martin. The comments from our viewers have been overwhelmingly that it was a fantastic presentation. We have actually got too many questions to be able to pose to you now. I would really like to invite you back to talk to us again, possibly after the inquiry at the Scottish Parliament, because that will give us an opportunity, you know, to hear from you what the reaction has been and what other activity might be happening. And I also, as we've spoken about before, I think that the inquiry that you're putting forward at the Scottish Parliament is something that can be replicated in other parliaments as well. So it would be great to get some feedback from you on how that goes. So yes, we'd love to invite you back.
Well, you'll have to wait till September.
That's fine. I also just want to say I did remember that we were supposed to meet with you face to face today, Martin, in Glasgow, when we were having the European Tibet regional meeting. So it was great to have you here anyway. I also want to say you've touched on a few, or some questions have been raised about rivers. We are looking to invite Michael Buckley, who is obviously a huge expert in rivers and the Tibet region and the Mekong, and can talk about the treaties that you were just talking about. So we will look to have him as a guest in the future. I just really quickly wanted to reshare my screen just to remind people that they can get more information about the Tibet climate crisis situation. The tibetclimatecrisis.org has a wealth of information, much of which Martin has touched on today. We also have all of the previous talks are listed on that page under climate-talk, and Martin's presentation will be up shortly, along with a number of the papers and reports that he's written and released. We will share those on the tibetclimatecrisis.org site, so you can find those and read them. They're hugely informative, as I'm sure you can imagine. But there is also a Take Action page with a number of different petitions which are linked to some of the points that Martin's raised about damming, Tibetan nomads. So please do visit the page, have a look, and see what more you can do. And I'm going to finish there. I'm going to say again, thank you so much, Martin, for joining us.
You're very, very welcome. Thank you for inviting me, and I look forward to Michael's talk.
I'll let you know when it is.
Absolutely.
Thank you. And thanks, Lobsang, for moderating.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lobsang.
Bye.
Bye.